So we'll say a couple things. First, thanks everyone for coming. This is really helpful, and I pushed this myself. We were having a discussion in youth group. We're talking about topics that would be, I won't say provocative, but just what are key questions that our youth are facing, and I would not have done the research unless I said, we're going to do this, and then publish it, and then people are like, hey, can you record it? So thanks to everyone who's also online and watching this in a recorded version. More than one person said, I cannot believe you're doing that. Emails came in and said, wow, all right. I mean, it just said the title, wow. So with that, how do you do something like this so it doesn't turn into an utter disaster and kind of over my head? And I did feel over my head, stepping into the world of transgender and having some idea of what is going on felt like stepping into a dark soup. I had really no idea where we're going to come out, and it's not like preconceived notions that said it's so clear in the Bible that do not murder is so clear or something like that. Where do we find stuff in the Bible? What does it have to say? So number one, I am not an expert. I did a bunch of reading, so special thanks to a number of people. One would be Greg Eilers had a book. He was a Missouri Synod pastor that was transgender. Also a book by Preston Sprinkle. That was probably the most helpful, and it was so good that I was listening to it and taking notes, and I thought, I'm going to buy the Kindle version, and I copied liberally. So the examples that I have, and that's what I'm going to say are very obvious, are directly from Sprinkle's books when I give individuals. And also another person that reached out that I knew from previous ministry I was involved in gave examples. They work at a behavioral health clinic, and they gave an example of someone they worked with in that process. And I also understand it is super... and James Emery White, I didn't mention him. He's a blog that I read, and then he also has talked on this a bit. And then another woman I want to make sure, Abigail Schreier, if anyone's ever heard of her, she's probably one of the more famous speakers on it, and she was one of the ones that addressed the House when they talked about that. What's the bill where they're talking about the equity bill, or what was, anyone know it? I'd have to look it up. So she had some good things to say. She's a speaker who talks around the country and talks on the topic. She's also written a book on gender dysphoria, so we're going to talk through that. So before we get anywhere, does anyone have immediate questions that I can tell you if it should be covered or if we can cover at the end? So does anyone have immediate questions you have, or should we just go? And then at the end, just whatever questions you have about just working with people, definitions, all this is stuff that I've tried to figure out. And I think I came on on the other side of complexity. So it is remarkably complex. At sometimes I would say super interesting because I didn't know these things, and sometimes super frustrating. And some point I'm just like, what? I don't understand this at all. But multiple readings and going from a different thing, and even things I thought I understood, I thought, okay, I got this nailed, it's in the box, and then I start reading something else, I'm like, oh, I totally missed what that person said, and another person, I found it very helpful the way they talk. So if I'm not very helpful, I can give you examples of books that might be helpful. And the things that we're going to do and talk about overall, I want to make sure that this is a humanized discussion. It's pretty easy to talk because this is pretty politicized. When you're talking about one end, 10,000 genders, this is crazy, and the other end, you have to let all people do who they are. Somewhere in between, we're talking about human beings, and I'm going to give some examples that really do that. There's a guy that was Preston's friend, and his last name is, I'll find it here in a second. I'll find it later on, I'll mention it. He has this quote. He's worked often with trans individuals, and you can see that in your book. He's a psychologist. He said, if you've met one trans individual, and you could kind of guess how this is going to end, it says you've met one trans individual. That's probably the biggest thing. This is such a small percentage of the population, so even if you know someone who is trans, we're talking 1% of 1% of the population would be when we start talking about intersex. This is a small percentage of the population. So it's conceivable that you know someone. Our students and our youth are probably going to know more people, and we'll talk about that as a generation. How many people identify not as cisgender, which is basically male or female. I would be considered cisgender. I say I'm male and identify with my biological sex. But they would say that they're somewhat gender fluid. And you get examples I'll have Kristen Stewart from the Twilight series or Miley Cyrus, and this is a high percentage. Some in that generation, that's 11. I'll look at the dates, but Generation Z, I think it's as high as 17% are kind of would almost say we're LBGQ and not identify directly with, as we would understand traditional. To put it in percentage-wise, that would be the overall population for LBGQ is probably 5%. So it's 3 times the amount. So 1 in 6 is what we're talking about in the generation of our teenagers, so it's kind of a big deal that way. So moving on, at the center of what we're talking about, here's some of the questions that I hope to answer by the end. Are male and female the only options? What about people who are intersex? It's no longer called intersex now, it's DSD. Can someone be born with a male brain and a female brain? This is really at one of the hearts of the question that says, is your brain male or female? We can talk about some of the science involved in that. My dad was a science teacher, so I don't mind digging into some degree, but at some point it like starts to go over my head. The science on that is not super concrete, and so to say absolutely people have a male brain or a female brain. But for sure, there are people that experience what we call gender dysphoria, and it used to be called transsexual. You'd hear that, and then it changed, and that was considered a disorder. And it wasn't until relatively recently they changed it into dysphoria, which just means I'm confused about my gender. So this has changed over time. And just to speak on that a little bit, that has changed when you're talking about ideologies. That has changed over time as well. So I listened to a group, a guy named Joseph Nicolosi was talking about homosexuality at the time, and that was part of the ideology that changed it in the official manual from a deviant behavior, it was called, and then it became, I can't remember how they changed it, but basically from a medical perspective, it changes how you handle something. So if something is a disorder, let's say anorexia or bulimia, we would consider those disorders, which means if you go to the doctor and you said, I am vomiting all my food up, they would then try and treat that. This is now switched to dysphoria, which means if we, instead of calling like bulimia, for example, a disorder, we changed it to a food confusion. That just means like, oh, they are preference or something like that. The doctors that we have now, if you would send your kids to a doctor, no longer do they look at a manual and say that this is an issue that should be fixed. They're saying this is something that should be affirmed. So now we're really talking about two vastly different ways in which you treat something. If you go into something and it's a cold and they say this is a sickness that needs to be fixed versus something like that's perfectly fine. Does that make some sense? And this is where the whole argument is somewhat changed. So at the center of this is someone who experiences what we call incongruence, the difference between their mental sense, and I'm going to look at my notes a lot, and their biological self, and which ones determines gender. That's what we're trying to figure out. In order to humanize it, I'm going to give you a couple stories. This is from Preston's book. This is his friend Leslie. He refers to her a number of times. So Leslie is born female, but from the time Leslie was 4 years old, they experienced life as a boy. Leslie felt like a boy, thought like a boy, played like a boy. When all of her other little girls wanted to play tea or house, she said, I wanted to play football. At the age of 4, I proclaimed that Wonder Woman was going to be my wife, and we were going to have superpowered children. I thought nothing of it. Leslie also remembers loving Jesus wholeheartedly from a very young age. My earliest memories are of the church nursery, Sunday school, and I've always known that I was a beloved child of God. I cannot remember a time when God's truth was not an integral part of my life. Leslie's struggle increased with age, making it hard to fit at youth group. I started to keenly feel a distance between myself and other girls. Leslie remembers I could not relate to their emerging womanhood. They were spending hours putting on makeup, styling their hair, and talking about boys. None of this interested me in the least. Like most kids wrestling with their gender identity, Leslie was wrestling alone. No one to talk to, no one to listen to. Nobody seemed to care. Leslie sank into dark periods of depression, and when isolation met depression, suicidal thoughts that are fairly common, a higher percentage than what we call non-trans population, quickly followed. I lived this charade until high school rolled around, becoming increasingly despondent and suicidal. Finally, Leslie summoned the courage to go to her pastor for help. Leslie explained this dysphoria to him, hoping for some pastoral guidance. Instead of offering guidance, Leslie recalled, my pastor escorted me out of the back door of his office and told me to never come back again. And I didn't. I didn't step foot in the church for the next 18 years. I hated Christians, especially pastors, from that point on. Leslie, desperate to follow Jesus, was ushered out of the church simply for struggling with this dysphoria. We have that example. And then we have another example, Stephanie. Stephanie grew up as a stereotypical feminine girl on the autism spectrum, which is really interesting. There's a number of underlying, especially for late or rapid onset gender dysphoria. That's teenage girls, essentially. There is a number of things, and one of those is I want to use the right words, what would it be called? Untreated mental disorders or mental health disorders. And on the spectrum, identify that 25%, that they're talking about those who identify as transgender, or 25% would have an underlying theme of autism, which seems like off the charts to me. So Stephanie, so she had no signs whatsoever. She told her mother, Carol, that she was transgender. Stephanie's declaration seemed to come out of nowhere. No prior history of gender dysphoria, no tomboyish interests of behavior. We'll talk about what a typical run would be. Carol found out that Stephanie had just heard a presentation about transgender at school, a school where over 5% of the student population identified as transgender or non-binary. And binary, just for the kids, so binary, like if you do math or computer work, it's like black and white, zeros and what's the other one? Ones and zeros? There we go. So that's binary. They're saying they're non-binary. Carol took Stephanie to a gender clinic to seek counsel. The clinician told Carol that I must refer to my daughter with masculine pronouns, call her by a masculine name, and buy her a binder to flatten her breasts. He recommended no therapy, and there's no consideration of the social factors that obviously affected her thinking. I was directed to put her on puberty-blocking drugs, and doctors will often recommend puberty-blocking drugs for prepubescent children wrestling with their gender identity. And I've got a little note on the back. I did not understand the process. When someone says that they're transgender, this is a huge umbrella term. And in my mind, before going into this, I thought it was someone who's like their next step is surgery. Is that how? It's very rare that they get surgery. I did not know this. Gender reassignment surgery, but there's a new name for it now. Usually it would start with someone who, if transgender, just says, I'm going to function as I'm a biological male and I'm going to function as a female. Nothing else. That doesn't mean they do anything else other than live or dress as the opposite gender as their assigned biological sex. The next, with their young and their prepubescent, they would recommend puberty blocking or hormone blocking drugs. The next thing would be they call it CHT, which is cross-sexual hormone treatment, which is now, like if you're a girl, you're going to get testosterone, and if you're a guy, you're going to take estrogen. So if anyone who knows anyone who's had prostate cancer, they have to reduce testosterone because basically it feeds off of that, so they give males estrogen, so that's going to reduce that. Then the next phase would be an actual surgery. And the age bracket of that is now coming down and down and down. This used to be something that you kind of had to be an adult. In Oregon, for example, they are pushing, and I think you can, get a double mastectomy, which they call a top-end surgery. You're going to get a double mastectomy without consulting your parents at 15 years old. So it's like it's a huge, huge deal as we get to it. That was their experience, and the daughter and Carol was worried, and I'll get down to some of it, because she was in New Jersey at the time, and they assured her that the drugs were safe, that all these drugs are safe, and we'll talk about how it leads to actually infertility if you take double those things. So if you take the cross hormones and you also take the puberty blockers, you will become infertile if you take that, and I think the period is less than 2 years. So all of this has like long-term ramifications, and I'll try and go a little bit faster. I'm seeing science people, they're going, okay, enough. Is there questions on science things before I get to biology? Okay, so from a biological standpoint, I'm going to talk a little bit on biology. What makes a male and female, reproductive distinctive parts, so women internal parts, you're talking about a uterus and a vagina, and external features, as you can imagine, and also men have external reproductive parts like penis and testes. And are there people, and this was the question, that are actually intersex? And this is a common question that I had. The percentage of people that are actually intersex, and this is really interesting, is 1%, basically 1% of 1%. And these are people that actually have atypical, if you want to know the definition, DSD, they call it, a mismatch between a child's chromosomes or genetic material and the appearance of the child's genitals. So I thought, wow, that's actually like 1 in 1,000, right? So that seems fairly frequent. But it's actually 1% of those 1% of 1%, ones that are not distinctly male or female is another 1% of 1%. So now you're talking, what's 1,000 times 1,000? 100,000? 1 in 100,000 would be someone who actually has both female and male parts. So there are human beings that they would call intersex that have a penis and a vagina and breasts, and they literally have both. Most of them, when they have any of these, what they call conditions of intersex or DSD, would have, they're distinctly male or female. And the reason they know that is because they look at their chromosomal, down to the chromosomes. So to be a male, you need a certain chromosome. You need an X and a Y. You need both. And so there's certain conditions that would show like XXY, XXXY, XXXXY. And so some of the ramifications of that is you're still a male distinctly, except you're not going to develop at the same full rate. So that means like your testicles may not be as normal, the typical human size, which also means you may not be fertile. So these are some of the conditions they have. But it's not a question is that a male or a female? You're talking about the the recognition of that. The way I describe it, if I was going to describe it with kids, I'd say it's kind of like M&Ms from a biological standpoint. They have like a green M&M and a brown M&M. These are the male and female parts. And then some people will have both of these parts. There's not like a third gender. And there's this idea that there really is kind of this third gender, and it's really kind of ambiguous. And so we'll talk about some of that. Recap what makes you, and I'm not going to go into all of this, but what makes you a male or female is internal reproductive organs, external sexual anatomy, endocrine systems that produce, those are the systems that produce your hormones, and then the presence of a Y chromosome. So biologically, if you would talk from a science perspective, and there's an article I'll quote a little bit later from science researchers that says that from plants down to animals, down to human beings, there is male and female, and that's all we have. So you'd say, what determines if someone is male or female? If we just looked at science, clearly we would say it goes down to your biological sex. However, what do we say when we look from a biblical perspective? What do they have to say? Questions on science stuff before we go. What muddies the waters a little bit is culturally, like maybe the cultural I'll get before we get to the idea. Culturally, there are certain things that we would say someone fits more in the male category or the female category. And I think this is the most vulnerable group of people that we have. If you know a boy who's maybe prefers the violin over football, people start to say, oh, okay. Or someone who likes pink over blue, they go, okay, this is the indication. A girl who likes fantasy football and doesn't want to like do ballerina stuff or whatever girl things are. And so you have people that are mixed in this. So culturally, this moves, and it also moves in how you dress, which we're going to talk about a little bit. So what is the issue there? From my perspective and a biblical perspective, there are obviously people that have different levels of how they exhibit in a cultural aspect their manliness or their femaleness. And some of this stuff is movement. Here's a quote from the Ladies' Home Journal. Let's see if I still have it. The Ladies' Home Journal, 1918, said, pink being a more decided and stronger color is more suitable for the boy, while blue, which is more delicate and dainty, is pretty for the girl. So this stuff changes, and then even in dress this changes. There's probably a few things that are still culturally only for females. I can't think of like a two-piece swimsuit for a guy. Like if someone is wearing a bikini, that's distinctly for a female. But like clothes has slowly changed over time, and it depends on what culture you live in. So if you go to Scotland and you wear a kilt, and a guy here wearing a kilt, if they didn't know it was a kilt, they thought it was a dress. This would seem unusual. But over time, you talk about women in the workplace, they used to always wear dresses, and now it changes to pants, and now they can actually wear suits that are fit for women, obviously, but I mean, you would say that used to be only worn by males. Even double-breasted, triple-breasted suits, you'd say, okay, that's how it goes. And you could see that on the other end, where I would say more clothes, it kind of went to men's clothes going to women, and I would say more now we see more effeminate clothes going to men. And you could see that like in workout clothes or something like that, or sweatpants. I mean, guys had sweatpants that said like, Go Team on them or something like that, and that's it. And now they're getting skinnier and skinnier, just like the jeans, tighter and tighter. And now I remember the first time I saw like the cuff joggers. The first time I saw those, I'm like, what guy would wear those? Guess who owns a pair of joggers, right? Like so, like just over time, this changes in how that exhibits, and I think that's a big deal culturally. And I'm very concerned because, from a pastor's standpoint, the people that people are reaching out to, if someone just doesn't necessarily fit in those gender norms, which would just be people's preference, they say, oh, you must be transgender. And there are people that they identify as transgender. If you go to school and it's a 12-year-old boy or a girl, maybe that's an easier one, that likes a short haircut, likes to hang out with the guys, they would say you're transgender. And in this culture, the encouragement would be to transition or start this process relatively early, which is a big deal because previously it would be kind of early onset, like 2 to 4 years old. And then most of those boys, most of them were boys, would transition like 70+% by the time they hit adolescence. Now we're identifying this way earlier, and if anyone is leaning one way or the other, 5 years old, they're saying we got to start this earlier and earlier and earlier. Okay? Transgender is an umbrella term for many ways in which people might experience or present or express or live out their gender identities differently from people whose sense of gender identity is congruent with their biological sex, which is basically saying it is a humongous umbrella for anybody who fits in that category along the transitioning period, or it could be some people, I think, in cultural norms that are living outside the cultural norms. So biblically, what are we going to look at? I've got some of those printed just for you. Hopefully that's helpful. We're going to walk through it. You're not going to find the word like transgender in the Bible, and so that would have made it a lot easier. The Bible's not like a definition, so we got to look at a few different places. We'll start in the Old Testament, and this would probably be kind of a key passage, Genesis 1:26 to 27. And I'll just read it because I have the microphone on. I think I have the microphone on. Okay, you just have it turned on. Then God said, this is at creation, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness. This is that we're imagers of God, reflectors of God's love and glory. We just talked about this on Sunday. So that they may rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, over all the creation that moves along the ground. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. This is a key component that God is saying, when I made human beings, they're not asexual. Many believe that angels would be asexual. They're not reproducing more angels. That's not their intent. But when we talk about human beings, God said, I make them male and female with the intent. If you look at the next verse, he says, I want you to do this, be fruitful and multiply. And of course, that means to have children. So we're talking about male and female so that they continue to have children and then rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air. So from creation, we would just simply say, part of our being imagers of God, people with souls, that God made us male and female. There's not like a third option. Is there anything very specific? This is probably the most specific we can get is Deuteronomy 22. You have that written there. The woman must not wear men's clothing, nor a man wear women's clothing, for the Lord your God detests anyone who does this. So this is like in the Old Testament cross-dressing. But what is one of the issues when we pull out something that says very specific from the Old Testament, do not do this? The Old Testament law was written for specific people for a specific time. So if I draw a timeline for you, there's specific laws for specific people. An example would be, do not eat of this tree to Adam and Eve. He did not, I don't have that command, you don't have that command, Adam and Eve did. And so now for the Jewish people, God said, here's my intention. I want you to follow these laws. There's 613 laws. One of these ceremonial laws or one of these moral laws, he says, I do not want you to cross-dress. And so we're going, does that actually still apply? There's a law that says don't cook a goat in its mother's milk. Don't eat shellfish. But I'm sure many of you still, if you're not allergic, eat like shrimp. Is that a fact? Right. So here is this an overarching theme that would say, you got to be a little bit careful to say, oh, it says it right there. There's no way you can do it whatsoever. Because some of these laws apply and some of these laws do not apply. So this is still applies. So we're going to look at another place. 1 Corinthians 6, 9 through 10. This one takes a little bit of math as well. Or do you not know that wrongdoers will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived, neither the sexual immoral or idolaters, nor adulterers, nor men who have sex with men, nor thieves, nor the greedy, nor the drunkards, nor the slanderers, nor the swindlers will inherit the kingdom of God. So we have this long list of things, but among those lists are men who have sex with men. And the words that they use are somewhat interesting. Some translations say like male prostitutes. And the word that they use, there's two things in Greek, and I don't want to kind of get too deep into this, but malakoi. So malakoi has the idea of being kind of very soft and effeminate, and so what they believe, there's another word that's a little bit more aggressive, that's also describing homosexuals. So you could imagine, they put them in two categories. One would be the transgressor, and one would be, for lack of a better term, the receiver in this relationship. So when the reason they say male prostitutes is because at that time, scholars would say and believe that one of the more common ways that someone would be a male prostitute would be that they would dress as a woman and then have sexual relations with a man. We even have an example of that from an emperor. I wonder if I wrote his name down. This is how deep my research got. Elagabalus would be his name, or Antonius. Antonius is how you'd say it in Roman. This was a guy who had many sexual proclivities, but one of those was he would go to the brothels and he would, again, for lack of a different word, he would dress as a woman and service men. So, I mean, this is the same kind of concept they have. That's from 200 AD. So this is the idea. So would we say 100% this shows like you shouldn't be transgender? We're seeing it multiple times. And maybe this is the simplest one, is simply to say at creation God made them male and female with this intent. Same thing with marriage. I think the easiest passage for marriage is just go back to Genesis. And then Romans 1 where he describes this difference. It's also written for you. Because of this, God gave them over to their shameful lusts. He's saying when people exchanged, they started to worship false gods, God said, go your own way. And this is what people did. Even their women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with men and received in themselves due penalty for their error. What do we see is one of the main issues that we have? They're changing. When they no longer worship God, they say they're not doing what is natural. And I think we would put that in that category. Your sex is given to you by God. Jesus himself was a man. It's not like he was asexual or something like that. God says, you as a created being are my reflector as male and female. And my call to you is to live out that in a Christian way as male and female. And I think that's probably the easiest way from a biblical perspective. So where does that put it if you would just simply go, all right, what determines if you're male or female? From a biological standpoint, you would say you're just male or female, that's it. You look at your sex. And then from a cultural standpoint, they're trying to tell you should look at your gender. And gender is the way that they talk about it. It's no longer connected to sex like it used to be, although it still is on your passport. I think it says gender instead of sex. Gender is how you feel and want to express yourself. And so from a biological standpoint, we'd say your biological sex determines if you're male or female. And from a biblical standpoint, I'd say God has made us male and female, with the very rare exception of intersex is what we're talking about, someone who has both male and female parts. But even in that case, most are distinctly male or distinctly female. Culturally, though, now it's up to you. So what does this mean? Are there people who actually feel, and you would say very much so, are when they look in the mirror and when they wake up, they see themselves as the opposite gender? Yes. And so there's different arguments about this, and I can't imagine the challenge that would go with that. I mean, and as someone who's never struggled with that, right, what right do I have to talk on it? But I can't imagine the battle if you're 3-4 years old and you have all these buddies and they want to like wrestle and you don't like rough and tumble play and you're a boy and there's all these things that make you feel different, and you look in the mirror and then you can imagine the horror of like trying to go to summer camp. You can imagine like all this awkwardness. The same thing is true when you're talking about homosexuality, for example. I put those in the same category on some level because it's not necessarily the same. But as ideologies, is it nature versus nurture? We don't know. I mean, we know that there's not like a gay gene, for example. But for whatever reason, nature or nurture, a person or a combination of those two environment lands at a place that they said, I have same-sex attraction. What does that mean to us as Christians? This is their reality, and we need to bring the love of Christ to them. So same thing with transgender. It's not really my place to say, the person says, I don't feel like, let's say a girl says, I don't feel like a girl, I feel like I'm a boy. I don't know if it's my place in that case to say, you don't feel those things. Yes, I do. No, you don't. Yes, I do. No, I don't. That doesn't make any sense. For whatever reason, for nature or nurture, they're at a situation where they're in front of you, and God is saying, here's an individual. How can I love and show concern to that people? So this is what we're giving an example of true gender dysphoria. I'll give you some examples. We had Leslie was an example. And the only reason Leslie was in a church, which is a fairly fascinating story to me, is she got married, became a lesbian. She had same-sex attraction. This is one of the original stories. And her partner, I can't think of her name, had a condition where her hand would shake, so she went outside and had a cigarette. And in the case of trying to light it, her hand shook and lit herself on fire. She dies. So this woman is utterly devastated. And so she calls around, and she actually makes contact with one of the more conservative churches in town and says, will you do this funeral? I can have a funeral I'm a lesbian. Will you have a funeral for my wife? She's never been in a church up until that point. And it was fascinating to see the response of the church, because what would be the response of the church if someone just said, hey, I got this call from a lesbian whose wife was, tragically died in an accident. Should we do the funeral? For me, I was going, oh my goodness, I couldn't imagine what was involved. Well, the pastor in that case, said, I am so sorry for your loss. I can't imagine what it's like to lose someone like that. We would love to do whatever we can to show you love and to help you work through this. Because of that pastor, not immediately just shutting her down, like she started to step foot into a Christian church, is very active in a Christian church, and still would say she struggles to this moment with same-sex attraction and struggles to this moment with gender dysphoria. So what is our response? I think that's an example. Here's another example from a guy named Alan. Alan grew up as a pastor's kid, but couldn't wait to leave the church after he graduated high school. Ever since he could remember, Alan had an unchosen desire to dress, act, and behave like a woman. And they'll describe that. They'll talk about like a serum going through their veins. They'll talk about like this compulsion. They'll talk about, and there's all these different things of just feeling at peace, like a guy wears women's underwear and things like that. Like this is like consuming to them. They don't just make this stuff up necessarily for attention. We're talking about true gender dysphoria. Didn't feel more isolated and ashamed. He grew tired of the hypocrisy of the church. Despite being a pastor's kid, I'd become upset with the hypocrisy of Christians, saying they were full of grace, but not putting it into practice, especially concerning LGBTQ+. After high school, Alan left the church, but he couldn't get away from Christians. One day, a Christian friend asked to hear Alan's story, so Alan told him everything. His desire to be a woman, his sexual attraction to men, his failures in trying to follow his own convictions about sexual ethics. Alan expected to be condemned. To his surprise, he was loved. Instead of the shaming and condemnation I expected, I was told that despite my past and present desires, God didn't hate me, and I was lovable by others and by God. These simple words pierced his soul. Alan gave his life to Christ, that's his wording, all because he had the courage to share his story with a friend who received him graciously. And here's his quote, which is kind of powerful. If I had never learned about pure, undistilled grace, I would have transitioned to a female and left the church. The thing that brought me to an acceptance of biblical masculinity was not a poignantly laid out exegetical argument against transsexuality, nor a fire and brimstone diatribe against homosexuality, but a man who gave me the space to speak about my desires openly and let me know he and God love me nevertheless. Another instance from a friend of mine named Phil, who worked in Rogers Behavioral in Milwaukee. He was talking about this instance that he had. He's talking about they have about 15 to 20 at the institution. He said, I got to know one of the transsexuals very well, or transgenders very well, a few years ago. After reading his chart, and since I worked directly at that time, he was Missouri Synod Lutheran, which is kind of our sister synod. We're conservative Lutheran. They're also conservative Lutheran. Our spirituality chaplain handed me books to give her, and so it was my opportunity to discuss, and he asked me, and he said, this is Phil talking, he said, I'm a Wells Lutheran, and he said, why don't you hate me, or why do you want to be around someone like me? His response was, I said, despite our stances on the issue, we believe in Christ crucified and God's grace, John 3:16. She cried and said she had gone too far. I assured her that it was not the case and that God was likely pursuing her as we talked. The story doesn't always end well as many of these cases. It's very, very complicated. The person found a church and had still struggled with her father. Her father said, you'll always be my son no matter what happens, but I'll always love you. And then later came back to the institution. He said he couldn't give me too many details because of an overdose. But he no longer was working with, I think I mixed it up, her transitioning to him. I think it was a him transitioning to a her. What does this all get to? For many, transitioning doesn't solve anything. The suicides rates are remarkably high, but there are truly transgender, dysphoric people who are happier now. So we can't say like every single one is totally devastated. The thing I think I want to focus on just a little bit is what hits us as parents. I'm not going to get into like gendered bathrooms and the MMA fighters. We can talk about that if you have questions about thoughts of that. We can talk about pronouns. That's kind of an often things that I had to look up to. Gen Z is a huge, huge thing that I just want to touch on. So Gen Z, that's people born 1995 to 2011. And they're talking about the percentage of them. 1 in 6 would recognize and say that on some level they're LGBTQT. Quote from a cultural standpoint, you just think about the culture that they have grown up in when you talk about our kids with like Bruce Jenner, and you talk about now Caitlyn Jenner, the sexuality and relationships. Kristen Stewart from Twilight said, I think in 3 or 4 years we're going to be a whole lot more people who don't think it's necessary to figure out if you're gay or straight. It's like you just do your thing. Miley Cyrus, I don't relate to being a boy or a girl. She's a singer if no one knows that. I think she's a singer still. And I don't have to have a partner relate to me as a boy or a girl. This is where they're running into it. They see labels as restrictions, so you get into pangender, gender creative, and all the things that list. I think on Facebook used to have so many genders, but I think now that they took it off and they have a label even for custom. So like no longer is this like super black and white. What does this mean? When they do this study, there's a lady named, I think Littleton. I can tell you, give me 2 seconds. Of course, I'm not going to see it. Littman is her name, Dr. Lisa Littman. She started researching one of the things that I think is like the scariest thing, which is rapid onset gender dysphoria, or ROGD. And it typically, as I said, this came on at like 2 to 4. It'd be pretty obvious if you had a boy who dressed as a girl, always wanted to put dresses on. You say, what's going on here? Most of them grew out of that, meaning they didn't necessarily say, I want to transition to a girl. But you can imagine from a sexual identity standpoint, most of them became homosexual males. That's how the stats would say. But like 70% of them grew out of it. This is a late onset. We're talking about girls in their teens, and they started to do a study, and it's not a ton, but they did study like 280 parents where they had late onset teen girls, and these are some of the things that they had on that thing. Many of them were more popular after they came out as trans. They engaged in heavy online and social media activity, more than normal, surrounding their coming out. Many of them had mental health concerns and that were not being dealt with. I said it was over 60%. And if you're talking about the rise in this, I can't pronounce it, Tavistock Center in London in 2009 treated 17 females that were transitioning. And in 2019, 2,240. And so the people who are studying this are putting this in the same likelihood because they call it a contagion. And you can think of other disorders or challenges that girls and their teens would face as a contagion, meaning around other girls, this is something that they face. When you have higher percentages of suicide, for example, there's more suicide among those girls. When you talk about anorexia and bulimia, they see the same kind of things. That this isn't universal across all schools. You'll see it in a particular school or a friend group, which is identifying like your body type and things like that and who they're hanging out with. They're seeing the same thing happen. And here, the example from Stephanie in the beginning of the story, 5% of her class identified as trans. She just watched a presentation on it, and now this is what they're going through. The super scary part, I think, from a parental standpoint is, and that's what I'd say, be a parent, if I just draw a line on it, is someone who is 5 does not necessarily know who they are and what they want to be. Someone who is 12, ready to make a decision if you are going to be fertile or not fertile. There's a 15-year-old girl in London, I can't think of her name, Kyle or something like that, Kylie. She won a case where she sued the organizations that were encouraging her to transition because they did not fully lay out all the ramifications of infertility. And a 15-year-old, I think she was 15, and she got a double mastectomy. I mean, like all these things that like last forever. And just imagine what tattoo, I mean, I think on a side note, like what tattoo would you got as a 15-year-old? Would you still be happy with it, right? And you just like, what was I thinking? And how many decisions when your brain isn't fully developed till 25, I just don't think we can put young people in a position to say like, let's determine your irreversible future with decisions you got to make right now. Big picture though, where are we at? Setting actual intersex aside DSD and just saying, are there people who truly face this? I would say absolutely yes. I mean, for the more I research it, it's not just some joke. It's not just something. There are real people that are really struggling with this, maybe even in our congregation. Same thing with homosexuality. And I would like to think, the percentages would say there are people in our church that struggle with same-sex attraction. I would like to think as a pastor, you meet one transgender person, you met one transgender person. I don't have all the answers, but maybe we can together look at God's word and have enough care about people to say, what would next steps look like? And let's figure out what God has to say in your very complex and unique situation. The goal ultimately on me is someone identifying as their biological sex, but also honoring God. So that's really it. Every one of us is dealt a different hand when it comes to the fall into sin and how that affects us. Some of it could be anger, some of it could be gender dysphoria, some of it could be same-sex attraction, some of it could be you name it. That's not the question, right? Like we said that earlier. That's what explains maybe who you are, but it doesn't define who you are. And how do we reflect and show God's love in light of whatever condition, whatever situation we have? I think that's the real question we want to walk people through. And how do we show God's love in that way? So, oh, you couldn't hear me the whole time? Oh, just now. I was like, that would have been helpful a little while ago. I've got some more stuff on here. Is there open questions? Maybe on, I'm thinking what questions might have when you talk about pronouns, like how do you handle that at work? How do we handle it? If you got a friend, if you're a teenager and you got a friend who's talking about transgender, you have questions on anything like that. Yeah, Zoe?
How do you think, what do you think the Bible says about parents maybe reacting to, or what you think of parents reacting to kids coming out as
Yeah, we're called to love people, and I think it's just like the church. The church. I mean, yeah. Okay. Yeah. The question is, what does the Bible say about parents? And I think parents are really we see that relationship. God is our Father. You see that kind of comparison, and so in a sense, it's a microcosm, or you could say a bigger version. The church is. So what are we called to do? We're called to love people. We're called to show them God's grace. We're called to bring forgiveness, but we're also called to confront sin. So I mean, that's the same thing a parent would do. But how do you do that in a super loving? I mean, acceptance doesn't necessarily mean affirmation, and I think that's the challenge that we have with all things that say, I totally love you as a human being, and let's look at God's word together and see what that has to say. I think parents are called to do that, and individuals are really called to do that, and so is the church. Other thoughts on it? The pronoun stuff, the more I know there's some that take a hard line. Even a guy named John Piper, a very famous Presbyterian preacher, said, like, I can't lie, so if someone's not a female, there's no way he's going to say she or he. More of the stuff now, I'd say if you really had a desire to have a relationship with someone and try and get somewhere with there, if they prefer to go by a certain name or a certain pronoun, they call that, I can't think of the term for it. It's called, basically off the word hospitality, which is basically saying it's respectable to a person that says, this is how I want to be identified as. You would say, okay, I will identify you as that out of respect for you, because our ultimate goal is to build a relationship, to have a real conversation, not just to like win a 10-second argument. I don't think that doesn't go too far. That's kind of where I fell on it after reading more of the stuff, but I'm not living it, right? Like, I mean, I'm sure many of you at work you're going through some of this, and like, how do I address this, and how do I handle this? And the super scary thing is like the ideologies behind it. So the transgender isn't necessarily behind this idea of like transgender people in sports. Like collectively, I would say that they're not necessarily behind that, thinking this is a great thing. Collectively, not necessarily pushing down assignments. They're not against transitioning, but they collectively are not necessarily, and they're not in favor of like going earlier and earlier and earlier. Like that's coming from an ideology, like almost like a political agenda, which is pretty scary. That's from what I read. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about what you meant by doesn't mean affirmation, acceptance versus affirmation? What would that exactly look like if we had some of our teens who have friends, and we want to build that relationship to share Christ? What would that exactly look like? Or what could they say? Like, how would they approach conversations?
Right. I would think, I mean, everyone here now at this day and age, I would think would know someone who's like homosexual, for example. And how do you express, and how can you show that you accept them as a human being, you love them, you care about them, you're okay with them coming to dinner. I mean, you'll go to their wedding if they asked you. I mean, like, these are all things, but at the same time, if they came down to it and they said, do you believe what I'm doing is right? I'd say biblically, God says it's not, right? So I think it's some way to be able to somehow, it's a fine line, and I think sometimes you're never going to feel good, to be honest. I'll give you an example in a different kind of world. If I have someone who doesn't regularly go to church, or maybe has gone like once, I'll get a phone call sometimes and say, hey, will you do this funeral? No matter what I decide, it's not going to feel good. So I can go there and I can say I preach the gospel, but in my mind, what is the story being told to everybody who's at the funeral? This guy never goes to church, but obviously this guy gave him the stamp of approval, so now he's in heaven, and everything's good. So that doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel good either if a family calls and said, my father died, will you do the funeral? I'm like, he wasn't a church guy, so no. So either way, I feel terrible. And I think as you go on this line, you're never going to feel like I'm really nailing it, because you're going to end up being too far on the love part and probably too far on the truth part, and you're trying to get both of these. Well, yeah, good. That's good. So the question is, can truth and love be separate? And you see it on this issue. Imagine whatever issue you're trying to confront. You got a friend who's having an affair. That's maybe a good one. That's not good, but I'm saying it's a good example. So loving that person could say, hey, it doesn't matter, like your new boyfriend, come on over for Thanksgiving, like no big deal, and there's no truth to it. The other end is the truth as a weapon, like weaponizing truth, which is just blasting the person. And are you doing that so you feel good about yourself? Are you doing that so you can hurt them because maybe they're more successful than you and you want to feel lousy? Are you doing it for whatever reason? When those go together, what does that look like? And it's going to look a little different for each case when you're saying, I love you enough to tell you the truth. And if you love someone enough, you'd say, knock this off. I care about you. You should not be having an affair. And let's see if we can mend the relationship you have or not. Let's look at God's word. Let's get the right people and like move forward. And I'll do that with you. And I think that's really maybe being to walk alongside somebody. That's maybe how I would say it versus just blast them and walk away.
Yeah, I think, biggest concern is that you yourself don't want to become the person that's sinning, right, in a situation like that. So I think that's probably the hardest thing to
Well, it's super hard because of cultural reasons too. You talk about, the question or the thought was it's really hard. But you just think about Jesus and how he functioned and how he hung out with, like it says, the prostitutes and like the lowest of low. And you're like, wow, I don't know how he did that. And I wonder, like, how would that, even my congregation, what would that look like if they're like, where's Pastor? Oh, he's just hanging on Colfax, just hanging out with people, just talking it up. And people like, what? Like, oh, he gave him a ride, right? Like, he gave prostitutes rides to get them some food and stuff like that. Like, maybe when I'm like, I don't know what age, where there would be like above reproach. I mean, I don't know how you would do that. But Jesus did it all the time. So obviously he was a master of truth and love at the same time.
Yeah, maybe what would be an example of something that our kids could say when they're in that type of situation? What would be something feasible for them to say without guilt or feeling that they're doing something wrong?
I would say, can you imagine? So the question is, what could teens do with a situation, maybe someone who's experiencing transgender? Could you imagine on any level the loneliness that they feel? I mean, there's a reason they're suffering with depression that's higher than normal, suicide that's higher, suicidal thoughts that are higher than normal. And their dream is, and most of them believe, like this the transition is going to solve all their problem. They said that when they interviewed them, they asked, and they thought this was going to solve it all, even for adults. And that's why there's a high percentage of people that are detransitioning, especially from this rapid onset gender dysphoria. These teen girls that have gone through it and are going like, "What did I just do?" And they're coming back, and now you can look them up on YouTube and things like that. So I think the utter loneliness that they must feel, just like. But couple that with being a teenager. And a teenager, you're just trying to survive. I mean, you're just trying to make it, and you're just trying to not be the one made fun of, right? So maybe that's why you make fun of people, because you just don't want to be that one. And I think it takes someone super special, and God has said that we're all special enough to say, like, I am going to step into someone's life and show them care. And the phrase that I hear a lot is sometimes the hardest people to love are the ones that need it the most. And I think every one of us could think of someone at work or at school that could really use someone who's at least pleasant and nice to them and a lot longer than they're at. Because, I mean, how many people have gone through middle school, even if you were popular, and said, man, this isn't great. Now imagine if you weren't popular. Like, that's so lonely and so hard. So I think even that, just being willing to stand up for someone, I think that goes a long way. I mean, that's the theme of every Disney movie, but I think there is something to it that says we're just not going to do that around here. We're going to be nice to everybody. I don't know if that is helpful. Do you want more specific examples? She does not look satisfied. Person in the back. Yeah.
So, at my line of work for an airline, we've got a lot of these different gender situations.
Right.
And the part that I struggle with is I have no problem being kind and loving and everything in that way. My problem is the company pushing this on us in a way where we're having to do training and recognize all these different things and embrace them, encourage them. It's probably been like 3 years ago, I worked with a guy named Gabe, and then I came in one day and we have a girl named Leah, and it was Gabe.
Right.
And we're not supposed to act surprised or shocked, and it's very difficult to figure out how to being accepting of the choice and the lifestyle. So it's two separate things for me, like the corporate level and the
Yeah.
human level. And I'm in the middle
Right.
struggling, like just getting really more and more angry about being forced into this.
Right.
And having no issue being loving. I mean, we both work with several homosexual people. I'm not gonna
So,
judge
so if I say your question is how there's a balance between it's not hard to be loving, but then when it feels like in a workplace where it's coming corporately, and I think you're experiencing that in school as well, and I'm sure there is anti-bullying things that say like when someone is in class or if this would happen, they'd have education for everybody. I think there's two things that happen. Whenever you get any movement of maybe in a positive way, people go too far. So it's a corporate level, and so even should there be like family restrooms or no longer distinguished male or female bathrooms. And I remember when the laws came out like that, and it was so pushed, and the cost. I mean, for our congregation, even you're going, oh my goodness, are you kidding me? But then you hear a story, like humanize it a little bit, a story of someone who is transitioning. They don't feel appropriate in either bathroom because they think they're a guy going in the women's bathroom, and they feel out of place in the guy's bathroom. And so they don't drink, I mean, I read the story, they don't drink coffee when they go to church. They limit it because the most scary thing for them is to find a bathroom. And they won't go to a place that doesn't have a single place. So do I agree with like the push to make everyone do this and all the costs? And sometimes you're like, give me a break. But then overall, as a human level, it sure would feel nice that someone cared enough, like at your greatest fear of all time. So on that level, more and more that I read it, humanizing some of that is, you talked about an individual, I'm not going to say that person's name, but I mean, just to ask them, like, what's your story? I think there would be something to that. And it doesn't sound like they're afraid to say, because they say, oh, don't talk about it, and like never bring this up. I think if you just said, hey, you want to get lunch, like, what's your story? And if you heard a little bit from where their perspective was, I don't know that situation, maybe they're politicizing or something like that, but very likely they've had like not an awesome situation, and just to have someone who like listens enough, even that's someone who maybe even disagrees on a fundamental level, but still cares. None of us feel good, though, like when the government or any of that pushes farther than we think. And they always have to push farther than you think to get to maybe where they want. I would guess the trans community, when they talk about how far they're pushing some of this stuff with sports and stuff, like, they do not think it's great. I mean, I think if you did a survey and said, do you think this is good, they'd say no, but it's pushed so far just so that rights land here. The same thing happened in women's rights. I mean, it gets so far on the other end. On even hiring practices and minorities through race, you're seeing the same thing. It's pushed so far, and on how many, recognizing how many people of different ethnicities that you have, or how many women are working in the workforce. They're doing that just so that at some point it comes somewhere, maybe where it should have been in the first place. But if you just said, hey, we're going to aim for here, they're going to end here. That's my thoughts on it. I mean, that's just an opinion.
Well, it's frustrating because one of the recent trainings was a flight attendant wearing a male flight attendant uniform, beard, mustache, a male name on his name tag. A coworker referred to this person as he, and their pronoun was they. And the person that said he got reported to HR for not recognizing that this person is a they.
Yeah, how would you know that? So the question is, how do you even handle pronouns? So again, if you humanize it, so I'm like, okay, so the pronouns like they, he, she, and I'm being honest, when I first heard that, I'm like, are you kidding me? Like the first time I saw it as like a signature on an email that I received, but then you humanize it, there's a girl who, I gotta get this right, a girl who is gender dysphoric and sees herself as a boy that struggles with it, and they said when people refer to her as her, it brings her right back, and she has like suicidal type thoughts and like hurting herself, and you're like, wow, okay, so I would have never gone that far. But I mean, if you know, I'm not saying that's every individual, but this part, sometimes it's a power play. It feels like that. But in this case, you're talking about a person who this really puts them in a bad place. So would I be respectful and say I'd try to recognize that? I think I would.
I think you should at least shave the beard off if you don't want to be called he. But
Yeah, doesn't always make sense. Yeah, probably the easiest is just with their name. Other thoughts? I don't want to hold it. I mean, it's 8, so I don't want to hold this up. Yeah, Mike?
Wondering from just like a parenting perspective, like if, you know, you were talking about like how they try and suggest transitions for kids at early ages, things of that nature, right? And if you're raising a child that, you know, wants to dress in girls' clothes or whatever, like where's that tolerance level? Where's the, like, when does that nurture take place? And, you know, and be like, no, don't wear your mom's skirt, you know, or like
Where's my tolerance level?
Well, how do you navigate that
I think,
as a, you know?
yeah, so I maybe I wasn't as clear as we could have been. So it's saying in the Bible, don't cross-dress. It seems culturally across time that changes, but still the intent seems to be, don't present yourself as a woman if you're a man. And I think I would bring it down to, like, God has made you like a beautiful young woman, and you can do that in different ways. But this is the way that boys express themselves, and I mean, kind of watch where that line is. But I mean, if they're wearing dresses and things like that, I think I would steer them away. So Dr. Joseph Nicolosi, he's a guy I listened to, and he was saying homosexuality is a gender identity issue. And I remember I just came back when I was going through this. That was 20 years ago. I was listening to his presentation. I listened to it every year. But he had kind of a funny story, but he's talking about, like, they have to, boys should recognize that it's good to be a boy. And so he had the example of, like, throwing a boy up in the air. And the boys, like, freaks out at first, but then they start to laugh and have fun. And then he made the point that said, boys need to understand that danger is fun. And you know, the mom is freaked out. Like, I mean, every dad does this. They chuck their kid up, and then you don't spin or something. But and he goes, you know, the worst that happens, and we should probably cut it. The worst that happens. This is his quote: is, you know, you drop your kid on his head, but at least he'll be straight. But this is a guy who counseled over 500 men who, I mean, the pattern was very distinct, who struggled with same-sex attraction. So where is this getting at? I think you just say, God has made you a beautiful young man, a handsome young man, and this is what it means in modeling that, and don't necessarily freak out if it's, you know, on the edge of type things. They don't want to play football and they're okay with an instrument. I'm like, that's okay. Putting on different clothes, I think I'd say we're just not going to do that. That's where I would be as a parent. I don't know if that's a good answer, but
I guess a follow-up then would be like, I don't know, when I was younger, it'd be like, oh, I'm wearing ridiculously baggy clothes. You could fit 3 of me in the clothes that I was wearing, and that was like a fad or whatever. And it's like, it feels like society and culturally, with this transgender thing, I feel, as a parent, I look at it, I'm like, wow, there's a bad kind of feeling to it. Like, this is popular for a lot of children too, especially children and teens or.
That's the point they're making with that rapid onset gender dysphoria. It is very, very typically like high percentage male, young age, that transition. And this is females, which is against all stats, late onset, after puberty. Like, none of that makes sense, which is why they're comparing it to like bulimia or anorexia as a contagion among teen girls to somehow attend. I mean, think about the appeal of it is like teen girls often fight with their mom more than their dad. And so now, like, you can do this, you get attention. The school is saying, don't say anything bad, so now everyone's noticing. I mean, tell me you don't notice it. Like, if you go to a graduation or something, like, it's like, wow, okay. And then you can stick it to mom. I mean, like, there's so many factors that make it seem appealing at the time. You're in control. The doctor's telling you, like, parents, you have to listen to your kid. I mean, there's so many things that we're not helping the situation from a medical perspective. That's pretty scary. And they would say, like, there's pretty scathing things that say medically this just doesn't make sense and it's not right. And somehow they're pushing it lower and lower. I mean, that's just a thought.
So as parents, you know, how do we navigate that, those waters, I guess, especially in a biblical sense?
Well, and your kids, not all kids are the same. And I think what do we do as a congregation if someone's got a unique situation? You just say, I trust that person's doing the best they can under God in that situation. And there's a whole lot of different situations that it's pretty easy to jump to conclusions that you're saying, we're trusting that they're doing the best they can, and I'm going to try and love and support them with God's word. And each situation is different. I mean, I would say every one of our kids, if you look around, there's just different situations.
What happens when you get put into a situation where the person feels very strongly that we're in the wrong and has no want to believe that what they're doing is wrong and don't necessarily receive that message? Like, how do we handle those situations?
Yeah, so I don't know if you're talking about it in a home or a congregation, but a congregation, the example would be what happens if someone comes and they're not a hurting person looking to join fellow hurting people in need of repentance and God's grace, but instead they're coming with an agenda, a very distinct agenda. And I think you'll discover that with people at work, you'll discover that at school, you'll discover it at church. And I think at that point you have a hard conversation and say there's probably a better place for you than here. I mean, you can't do that at your home necessarily, but I think you have a hard conversation and when someone's got an agenda that said, if you can't listen to me with love and respect, it's hard for me to listen to you with love and respect.
And would you still do the same type of trying to share the gospel and grace, even though they feel very offended?
Right, if you're talking about unrepentance, I mean, when they're talking about the gospel, it says don't give the pearls to swine, and the picture of that is if people have no interest in God's love and forgiveness, you don't just keep throwing it that said God loves you no matter what. Anyway, I think sometimes there you need the law, and that's really the balance that's really difficult, is when do you have even with your kids, like how do you have a hard conversation of discipline, saying that is not right, and love. I mean, you pray you love your kids enough that you discipline them, I guess, and you're going to mix it. Plenty of parents, when they shut that door, go like, I don't know if I did a good job there. I mean, but you don't, right? Sometimes you have to go back to your kids and say, that wasn't my best effort. And sometimes it's a show, to be honest. Like you slam the door, and you're not actually that mad. You're just trying to make a point that that's not okay. I mean, hypothetically, Owen.
So, I mean, would it be a good tactic to talk a lot about prayer and how we can use prayer, and sometimes that might be our only option?
I'd say, yeah, the use of prayer seems essential. And how many of us, this would be myself included, are getting in these conversations all the time? Or how many of us, it's way easier to keep like double arm distance and just say, they live their life, I live my life. I'm going to make my assumptions and read my articles. And I would guess most of us are not engaging in conversations and concern and to try to bring a relationship to people that see things different than us, whether it's political, whether it's the trans topic that we're talking about, whether it's, you name it, religion. I mean, I would guess most of us are not engaged in those conversations. So I think our biggest concern is maybe get off our butt and start having some conversations.
It could take years for that to happen, to maybe change someone's heart, to really build that trust with somebody. Everyone has a story that got them to where they're at, right? So I have this situation at work where it's not the transgender type, but it's an angry coworker, and I've dealt with this person for probably 8 months, and I've kind of got her toned down quite a bit, and she's now going to church. Not this church, but so I'm not going to name any names. But
Well, what makes a relationship, and you're talking about vulnerability, at the heart of it is the best of relationships, which means it's really easy to have a relationship where you don't know anything about me. And whatever I present on Facebook or how I talk, when you get to really know someone, which is my wife knows enough about me that with like a single 2 sentences could just blow me up. But what does that mean? I mean, that's vulnerability with someone. And how many years do you think it takes with someone at work that they're really telling you, this is who I am and here's where I struggle with? I don't hand that off. I mean, most of you do not know what my most vulnerable things are. My wife does, but not a lot of you. I mean, you know this. You just know I have them. I mean, maybe that's enough. And I know some of the things going on in your lives, which is a great privilege to me, that said you've been willing to open up a little bit to say, here's what I struggle with. And I know that, and I say, I'm gonna protect that. And that's what a relationship is. When you talk about, like, what does it look like to have these conversations? It's not gonna last in a day, and it doesn't happen one way, right? Like, I'm the know-it-all who knows all these things, the sage. It kind of has to go both ways, which is really hard to get the good relationship with someone if you're willing to just listen and go, yeah, okay, that's really tough.
It is, but
versus saying, here's some of the things, I've struggled with the same things before myself. Because that's risky. It's risky whenever you share anything with anybody, especially people you don't know. Yeah, Emily?
So, since homosexuality and transgenderism, I guess, are considered sins in the Bible, how does it weigh compared to other sins? Like, is it the worst thing, I guess?
That's a great question. So the question is transgender and homosexuality the worst sins? I'd put them in, all sins are the same, so we know that for sure. God puts them in the same category. Where people really struggle, especially with like homosexuality or transgender, is because someone is saying, this is who I am. So if let's talk the other extreme. Someone murdered someone, and is that forgivable? We'd say yes, but they're not murdering someone every morning. Does that make sense? Like they don't wake up, they murder someone, and say, this is who I am, accept me. So that's I think that's where the church is really struggling in dialogue, is where that's at. So that all said, it's not that they have or struggle with these things. That's not the issue, because we all have our own things. It's how are you going to live that life with that? I mean, to use the cards you've been dealt, that makes it sound fatalistic, but how are you going to live your life in light of God's grace? And how are you going to reflect that life in the world, no matter what thing you're struggling with, whether it's transgender or homosexuality or a desire to have an affair or pornography or like alcoholism or drug. I mean, all of these things the things that I see. No matter what you've been given, how are you going to live like that? How are you going to live in God's grace? And I think that's the thing. You always want to bring them back to Jesus, not like, I can't believe you would do this. I think that's the easy thing to do, especially with sins that we don't struggle with. But, and especially situations like that. I heard another guy who, I just lost his name, he died. He was part of like the AIDS movement, became a Christian, and he had an illustration just talking about someone who was involved in sexual sins. This was a man who was very active homosexual, and then he became Christian, and he said, you know what, you don't end up, and sanctification for the students is like living out my Christian life. He said, you don't like open the door in the elevator, you're on the 90th floor of like doing everything right. He said, sometimes you're like on floor 1, and having enough patience with people in your life that are struggling with whatever it is. Anyone who knows someone who's alcoholic, it's not like day 1 everything's great. I mean, they fall off the wagon, they do all these different things, and the same thing happens with any of these things that people are struggling with. So actually Mike Haley, who is the guy who at that conference, the Love One Out conference, was one of the speakers, got married. He was former gay, his wife was former lesbian. It's like this beautiful Christian story that they got, and they had kids. He had an affair with a guy. That came out in the news like 5 years after the conference. I watched it. So, I mean, it's going to be an elevator that's moving up and down. With all our sins, right? I mean, if you don't, yeah. The ones we're on the top floor are sins that don't bother you at all. I mean, it really is. So then we look at that and say, I never have any issues with, like transgender, for example. There is no inclination in my brain. I don't understand it. So it's really easy to look down from there and say, man, why aren't you guys living like I live or something like that on that particular sin? But the ones I struggle with, they might nail, like being never gossiping. And I'm like, wow, that's not that big a deal. The Bible barely mentions it, right? So, other thoughts? This was helpful. Why don't we end in prayer? This is super hard, super difficult. If you got additional stuff that we want to talk about, we're happy to talk it through. Or if you have your own situation. And the end story is, especially for kids, this is over your head kind of stuff, to be honest. And you can love and show concern. But I think it's saying, sounds like you're in a tough spot, and try and show them to the right help. And the right help in the medical world is sometimes saying, like, you got to go all in if you're even thinking about this. It's probably worth a stop, I would say, to say, hey, have you ever thought about talking to someone? Talk to my pastor, or talk to someone, my parents would care about you enough to like hear your story. And maybe, pass this on to the adults, to be honest. It's not a problem you have to solve as a 14-year-old. Heavenly Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, there's so many difficult things in this world. We're complex human beings. We're complex in the ways that we live. But you are so simple. You see right to our heart, and you see sin. You see right to our heart and see a need for grace, and you bring that grace to us. Help us be reflectors and givers of that grace to the people in our lives. Help us to overcome all the trepidation that we have to build relationships with people who need to see love and need to know you. You died for the sins of the world, and there's no one who's excluded in that. And sometimes we'd like to think just the people that we're comfortable with, but in no way do you give us that mandate. Instead, you say, go and make disciples of all the world. Help us to have the vigor, the energy, just to take a step forward and trying to reach into people's lives who are really, really hurting, and give us the right words in the situation and to come alongside them, the time and the energy to show them who you are. We're not going to look at all things, but instead we're going to see who you are, and you died for the sins of the world. You bring grace to everybody. We ask this in your name. Amen.